All right, part two. Uh, Hand me a Corona. Hold my Corona. That's what we'll call this, maybe. Hold my Corona. So, transference. We've spoken about this a lot in the past with regard to the left. Basically, the idea that whatever they're guilty of, they try to blame others for. It's a defense mechanism. Psychologically, I don't want to get too deep into it. I'm not a shrink, but it's somewhat obvious for people who understand human nature, and I am a student of it. The only way they can compartmentalize and do the crappy things to this country and others that they do, and the only way they can look themselves in the mirror in the morning, every morning, is to assign the blame they would normally give themselves to other people. And in this case, on a political level, assign their political miscalculations and egregious behavior to the right. They've always done this. They are who they are. They have never changed. They try to convince people that Republicans were slave owners when they were so few of them as to barely make a blip on the radar. They try to convince that the right was just as guilty in trying to prevent them from voting and having citizenship, like the idiot Elijah Cummings once tried to lie to everybody about, even though the facts of history prove 180 degrees otherwise. They try to convince everybody they had nothing to, they were equal partners, if you will. America was to blame, not just the left, not just the Democrats. America was to blame for segregationists, Jim Crow, poll taxes, the KKK, and anti-civil rights movements. They try to take credit equally, if anything, if not completely, for giving blacks any kind of civil rights, which they were really against, even in 1875, the first Civil Rights Act passed by Republican Ulysses S. Grant, as well as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was promoted by Republicans throughout the late 40s, throughout the 50s, and the early 60s, and passed with greater percentages of Republicans than Democrats in 1964. They try to take equal credit for the suffrage movement from women and giving them the vote, when Republicans fought for 40 years against Democrats in Congress to give women the vote, and most suffragettes were Republicans, not Democrats. And it took a sweep of getting Woodrow Wilson out of the presidency and Republicans into Congress in 1919 to finally get women the vote a year later. I think it was a year later. A couple years later, whatever it was. So they're always transferring their guilt onto others. They tried it in the 60s with the big switch. Republicans suddenly became Democrats, and Democrats suddenly became Republicans. Criminals suddenly became cops, and cops suddenly became criminals. Why? Because their newest con they wanted to perform wasn't going to work unless blacks believed the Democrats were on their side for the first time in history. What is wrong with this chair? Anyway, and they continued to do it, but on steroids in the last 10 to 15 years. Almost everything that they say we're guilty of, they're actually guilty of. And just a few years, in just the last few years, Russia collusion, Trump, Republicans, guess what? Turns out Uranium One deal between Obama, Hillary, and Putin, that was Russian collusion, folks. The dirty dossier to try to undermine Trump's candidacy and presidency, guess what, folks? That was Russian collusion. And after 2.5 years of a Mueller investigation, he couldn't find any Russian collusion with Trump. Transference. What they're guilty of, they themselves, or what they say we're guilty of, they themselves are guilty of. Then they try to do it with Ukraine. Biden himself is guilty of collusion in a certain way with his son and the Burisma in Ukraine. There's other oligarchs that have been donating to Clinton Foundation and to other Democrats. Democrats wrote a letter and visited Ukraine all during the corrupt previous corrupt administration over there. 3 Democrats wrote letters to the government trying to undermine Trump before the famous phone call. I mean, it goes on and on and on. They're the ones colluding with Ukraine. But what do? In a hyper transference moment, they take all their blame and all their guilt and dump it on Trump for a phone call that had nothing to do with anything, that was perfectly fine, and impeached him for it. All the while denying him his normal civil rights and rights of common decency and justice. But the Republican Senate put a quash to it, rightfully so. But what a waste of time, money, energy, and goodwill. And probably the greatest example of transference I've ever seen in my life. So if this theory holds, and follow this with me, folks, if this theory holds, every time the left blames the right, and sometimes it's not even for significant things, sometimes it's these little piddling things, they themselves are guilty. If that holds true, and I believe it does on virtually everything, they say we're guilty of destroying the planet while they drive around or fly around in their private jets and going to their giant mansions that eat up 8 times as much energy as the normal consumer. Hello, Al Gore. These limousine liberals who say, okay for me, but not for thee. They do this all the time. They are guilty of this all the time, blaming others for their own transgressions. If this theory holds true, then let's apply this to today. What is the left blaming us for now? Coronavirus. They're blaming Trump, blaming the right, whatever, for the coronavirus. If not the creation of it, which they tried, the spread of it, which they tried, but now the handling of it, which they tried. Coming at him from all angles, trying to undermine the man when he's trying to do good, do his level best, not helping but hurting, part of the problem, not the solution, yada yada. So, could it not then be said that if they're blaming Trump and the right for how this is being handled, that maybe, perhaps, they actually are the ones who handled this badly? Well, let's review, shall we? Come to Chinatown. It's not going to be a deadly pandemic. We covered this in the last part. Then they blame Trump for everything he does and put the burden on him. Now that it's Trump's bailiwick and his problem, now they can take the equal and opposite approach. Now they hyperventilate when they talk about the coronavirus. Now they've got the death toll constantly on their screens. Now they overinflate the numbers. Now they lie and exaggerate how bad it's going to be to make Trump look bad. The opposite. That, my friends, is their act of transference, or their actual handling this badly when Trump is not, when the right is not. Because it turns out it's not as bad as it was going to be. Now, it's not necessarily the left's fault. They didn't come up with the data. They didn't come up with the models. But they love those models, don't they? Just like the bad models of global warming, they love these models that seem to not be able to predict jack diddly when required. And let's talk about how they inflated these numbers and why they bought into it, they wanted to buy into it, and what they're doing with this information. First of all, let's talk about the mortality rate of coronavirus. So I explain this as easily as I can for those of you who have not been able to follow this or have not heard this. The original data had the number of people they believed had coronavirus, known cases. and they divided the deaths into that number and came up with a mortality rate. It was a small snapshot with a small sample group. Any scientist will tell you, the larger the sample group, the more accurate the numbers. There's another flaw in this model, which I will get to in a second. When they did this division, how many people have died out of how many people they knew had the coronavirus, some estimates had the mortality rate as high as 3.4%. The WHO, World Health Organization, a bunch of frickin' globalist liberal asswipes who love China. Isn't it funny that the left seems to like the WHO? They gave them all this extra money when Trump shut them down out of Hollywood. Why? Because they love their commie friends in China, who they're trying to protect. There are no such things as coincidences, folks. It's all part of a pattern. Anyway, the WHO was happy to announce just how bad this was and this high mortality rate and how bad it was going to be. And the left loved to repeat it, and the propaganda coming out of China and all the rest of it. Giddily, happily. Excuse me. But there was a flaw. And the flaw was that they only divided the known deaths out of the known number of coronavirus victims or people who contracted it. What they either didn't know or didn't realize at the time is there are a lot of people who had it but didn't know they had it. Asymptomatic. There are a lot of people who had something, but it wasn't bad enough to go and tell the authorities about. What I had last week is a good example of that. Might have been a regular flu, a mild one, might have been coronavirus. I have no idea. Whatever I had, I didn't tell anyone, didn't go to the hospital, didn't burden the healthcare system with my silly crap, and I got over it. Took about 5 days, 6 days, I got over it. I'm 56, but I'm very healthy. Not a problem. When they figured out that so many more people, from 50 to 85% more people had it than was reported. And yet the mortality, the numbers of deaths were at a constant rate. But the total amount of people who had it shot up exponentially. Now you're dividing the death rate, number of deaths, into a much, much larger number. And that percentage, the mortality rate, went way down. Now they're saying it could be between 0.02 and 0.1%. That's actually less than most flus, folks. Do we shut down entire continents, businesses, states because of the flu? Now, it's a little more contagious than some flus, but it's not more deadly. Now, there's a thing called herd immunity, which is where you say you want people to contract a virus. You want them to get sick and get over it, because most people do. Because they become immune, or they are a block to getting it again. And if they go out into the world and they meet people who may or may not have it, they block the spread by having already had it. And if enough people with this immunity or with having had it go out into the world, they overwhelm the number of people who might spread it. And by a herd, they immunize the society itself. Herd immunization. This is actually the better way to do it. And the only way we're going to do that is we're allowed to go out into the world and do this. Which is another reason why I say this may have been completely unnecessary. If we were contracting it, surviving it, and going out into the world weeks ago, we might have been further along here than we are now, with flattening the curve. Just saying. But fear and fear-mongering, mostly from the left, prevents this. And what are they doing with this data? Well, they're ignoring the stuff that says that it's not as bad. They're continuing with their death toll, all in an attempt to hurt the president, as if that has anything to do with stopping the coronavirus. It doesn't. And they are trying to use this to keep people in their homes, to shelter in place. And the longer they do that, the better a lot of the people on the left like it. Why? Why do they want to destroy the country? Why do they want to destroy the middle class, small business, the economy? Well, it's pretty easy way to explain it. They want this new norm because they didn't like the old norm. Think about it. They didn't like what was going on. What was going on? Trump was successful. He had the best economy that this country has ever seen in its history. He had the slowest unemployment almost in history. He had that for blacks, minorities, women, all that. The narrative was kicking ass and beating Biden in the polls. It was a slam dunk he was going to be reelected for president. The old norm could not be tolerated. So let's do a new norm. And let's promote it. And let's try to sustain it as long as we can. In fact, let's even throw in some liberal, socialist, progressive ideas. So we have a stimulus package. So what does the left do? Instead of concentrating just on coronavirus, they throw in a bunch of pork and BS that had nothing whatsoever to do with the coronavirus. $25 million to the Kennedy Center. Did that save lives? A bunch of money to NPR, to the arts and humanities. Did that save anyone's life? Did that help hospitals? Did that create ventilators? And it held the thing up, the whole bill, for a whole week. Never let a serious crisis go to waste. Remember? They played politics. Shame on them. Shame on them. I can't stand the left, folks. I cannot stand these mothers. That's with a U, not an O. Mothers. Because, abortion. They don't become mothers. So, this is what they did with it. They bury the good stuff, they hyperinflate the bad stuff, and they try to hurt the president and give everyone a little window into something that they couldn't have done otherwise. Having the government become their nanny. Put them out of work, then give them more money than they would make most of them at work, making them not want to work. Even having some asswipe like AOC suggest maybe we should boycott going back to work so we can all have a little window, a little glimpse into utopia. Let's have a test drive of socialism. That's right, folks. This is a test drive for socialism. Let's go out there and drive it around, see how we like it. Maybe enough people, a small percentage, will like it more than they would have beforehand, before this, and they add to their roles of socialists. They add to the number of people who say, man, that's a bad idea after all. And then they get a little more socialism out of the whole thing. Something stays, something sticks, something bad to the country or the Constitution or to your freedoms or to something else doesn't get reversed, doesn't go away when this whole pandemic subsides. And they've pushed further down the slippery slope just a little bit more by taking advantage of the whole disease in the first place, the whole virus in the first place. Clever, sneaky, insidious, dangerous progressive lefties doing it what they always do. Doing what they always do. Now, last part, we'll talk about the 1918 pandemic and its comparisons and wrap this thing up. See you then.